Well, thank you all so much for coming. We're so pleased to have a full house here as part of our Living History series. Before I introduce Yvonne, the guest of honor, I want to thank our sponsors, Florence Bank and Joe's Pizza, who donated all the food tonight. So, thank you to our board who is serving wine and playing an important. Anyway, thank you all so much for coming. A couple details. I think many of you know that the bathroom is right around the corner. We have the two exit doors. One is here, and then the other one is open. Hopefully, the temperature in here is comfortable for everyone. This is a series this Living History series that we started about a year ago. And Northampton, as you all know, has an extraordinary history of many notable people living here, coming through here in the past, and certainly now in the present. And so when Betty and I first started, which is now actually next week, we will be beginning our third year here. Betty Shar. We and the board, we all thought this would just be a terrific series. And so far, we've had Frances Crowe here, Annie Woodhull and Gordy Thorne, and Jim Armenti. And at the outset, we all knew that we wanted to have Yvonne come. So Yvonne, I know this is sort of like a party for Yvonne. Because so many of you know her, you've worked with her. For those of you who haven't, prepare to be inspired. We're so pleased tonight. Mary Ford is here, the former mayor. Raise your hand, Mary. She'll feature in the story a little bit later when Yvonne speaks. But I just... in preparing, I also called Claire Higgins, who I knew had worked. And when I mentioned to Claire and invited her, she had another conflict, but she called, she said, when I think of Yvonne, I think of a model of citizenship. Yeah. Many other people wrote tonight and sent their regrets, but I thought I'd read one woman who was supposed to come tonight but wasn't feeling well enough, and she wrote and she said, I wanted to be there in support of Yvonne as I was one of the women who was fortunate to live in Yvonne's house a number of years ago while waiting for an apartment in Amherst. The person who was planning to come with me lives upstairs in Yvonne's house now and has since its inception. We wanted to be there to say a very special thank you. I'll need to write her a letter instead. So wish I could have attended to thank her in person. I don't need to say anything more. Please welcome Yvonne Freccero.
Thank you, everybody. I'm very honored to be here and very intimidated also. I want to thank Laurie for the opportunity of meeting with you all here again and having a chance to tell you a little bit later about the shelter. First, Laurie had suggested I should tell you a little bit about my early years, which also, is that better? Can you hear me? What? And I'll tell you a little bit about my childhood in England, which first introduced me to homelessness. I grew up in a small town in south of England called Totnes. And Totnes happens to be the second oldest borough in England, and it's very quaint. It has the remains of Roman roads. It has and the ruins of a Norman castle built in the 11th century, and a main street with Elizabethan houses in it. None of this history did I realize when I was growing up there. War broke out for England September 3, 1939, and I was at that time in my last year of grade school, just before I went to high school. And war had an immediate effect on us because certain things were to happen immediately. One was church bells would no longer ring, and if they did ring, it would be a sign of invasion. So normally on a Sunday, you would hear bells ringing from all the towns around. So it was very strange to have a Sunday and no bells ringing. The other thing that happened was they whited out, cleared out the signposts everywhere and the names of all the streets and all the towns, so that in the time of invasion, troops would come and wouldn't know where they were. So we all grew up learning to read geological maps and not looking at normal maps when we went walking. But it didn't intimidate us. Despite the fact that it was wartime, I have very happy memories of my childhood. But 20 miles from the town where I lived, from Totnes, is the city of Plymouth. And Plymouth had one of the largest shipyards in Britain, with the result that, as a result, it was a target in the early years of the war for the 1,000 bomber raids. Night after night, the city was pummeled until it was totally flattened. And at the end of the war, a new city was designed and built on top of it. So when Plymouth was bombed, and we would be aware of it because we could hear the planes going over us at night and returning after they dropped their load, it meant that thousands of people lost their homes. So very early in life, I was aware that through no fault of their own, families ended up with nowhere to live. Homelessness became, for me, a memory of people who needed help, people who had nowhere to go and relied on the rest of us. An interesting side of it, when the two centuries clash, the siren for the air raid warning was on the wall of the play yard of my grade school. It was in my last year of grade school. And every time the siren go off, we were supposed to grab our gas mask. Everybody was issued with a gas mask. Grab our gas mask and take an orderly ride and walk or run down to the moat of the 11th century castle. So that the moat was dry, I'm happy to say, although we had our gas masks and we probably needed them because the smells were so awful. But it's ironic when you think of a place that was used to be the protection in the 11th century was once again in the 20th century being used for shelter. I won't fill you with war stories. It's amazing what children get used to. You grow up amid devastation and you carry on in your own cheerful way. As a matter of fact, my closest friend's father was the air raid warden for the rural towns around, the farms around. We were a very rural community. And so in the early years of the war, he would take his daughter and me, and we'd go out to the local farms, and he'd light an incendiary bomb, and she would play the hose on it, and I would take the sandbag and run up and dump it on it. This was to show farmers that they should not be afraid of incendiary bombs, because incendiary bombs were used for it. I was very excited. I felt so important. It was a thrill. The seriousness, of course, does not penetrate at that age. Anyway, I was lucky enough to get a scholarship to go to college when the war was over. I was the first in my family to go, and I don't think my parents even knew quite what was happening. But when I went to college at that time, 90% of the students were ex-service vets, people who'd been in the war. So the average age was at least 8 or 10 years older than me when I went, which was, you had to grow up fast in those days. A very strange experience to go to college with people so much older than yourself. naively, I suppose, I wanted to study modern languages. In England or in Britain, you specialize immediately when you go to college. And I chose modern languages because I wanted to go to Europe and try and understand how wars come about. As I say, naively, we're still wondering. And so I studied French and German. And when I graduated, I was really extraordinarily lucky again to get a job with a special branch of the British Foreign Service called Passport Control. And it was for visas. We hear talk of visas all the time now. Well, my first job was in a visa office. They were all overseas postings, and my first job was in Vienna. I had never been on a plane before. Nobody in my family had been on a plane before. I wasn't really quite sure where Vienna was, and my parents certainly were totally surprised and not knowing what to think. Anyway, I went to Vienna. We landed at the airport, and this is realized early 50s, post-war years. Europe was still devastated. So the plane landed in Vienna, and we got on the bus to go into the city, and there, standing on the stairs of the bus, was a Russian sentry with a drawn rifle. Vienna, the Allies had all raced during the last years of the war to Vienna to try and get there first. And the Russians made it first, unfortunately, with the result that the city was devastated. So I arrived excited in a city that I heard of a lot of, but had no idea what was ahead of me. The city was in bad shape. The opera house had not been rebuilt. However, while I was there, all the opera singers were there, and so they performed in other theaters. So I was very lucky. During opera season, I could go to an opera every night of the week because there was nobody there, no tourists, nobody. The place in Vienna was closed. It was in the middle of the Russian zone, and you had to have a special military pass to get there. But the city itself was managed by all the occupying powers. It was an international city, so the Russians, the Americans, and the British all had a role. And once each country took a turn, a month at a time, to be in charge of the city. For me, during my last years in Vienna, I lived right in the center of Vienna, and I could feel very safe walking home at night because there was always a Russian sentry right behind me, following me. So I felt very secure. Those were exciting times to be in a city. I look back on it as almost like a fairy tale, but if any of you are old enough to remember the movie The Third Man, that was the Vienna that I lived in those days. It was a spy city, and it was very exciting. And my boss was obviously involved in, he used to hide and come in, and he was a haunted man, and there was a lot of secret documents going out. But at that age, for me, it was just exciting. Except we did the visa work for Australia and Canada. And the post-war Europe has a lot in common with our world today. It was full of refugees. Now our refugees are coming mainly from the Middle East. In those days, the refugees were all Europeans looking to leave Europe to get to either Australia and Canada and start life again. And we did, it's really interesting to be in the opposite end of visa work. We did the visas for both of those countries. And it was really sad to realize that in those days, the big fear was tuberculosis, and everybody had to have examination. If one member of the family had a less than healthy gram, either the family could leave and leave the one person behind, or everybody would stay behind. And this is a terrible choice. I guess it's something that we learn a lot about these days when we hear that one member of the family comes and then the rest cannot follow. it was a very heartbreaking situation. So many families felt they needed to go, but then they would leave behind one child in a refugee camp. After I'd been there about 3 years, I think it began to get to me, and I asked for transfer. And being lucky again, I was sent to Athens, where a wonderful posting, and I was enjoying myself thoroughly when a telegram came through to say, would I leave the next day and go to Tel Aviv, where the Secretariat had a breakdown. So goodbye to Greece, which I hadn't had a chance to visit because I had just been enjoying myself, and went to Tel Aviv for 2 months. Again, in a very busy situation, but very interesting. And when that was over, I was then sent to Germany, to Frankfurt. Frankfurt was in the American segment of Germany. And so I worked in the visa office in Vienna, in Frankfurt, where I met my husband-to-be, who had been a student at Johns Hopkins University, French and German languages he was studying, and had been called up because it was the Korean War, and was sent to Germany. Well, that also starts another interesting little episode in my life. I came to the United States on a troop ship, and we were met by John's parents, Italian immigrants, who were a little appalled that their precious son was bringing home an English wife. I was probably the last thing that any Italian family wanted. But he was the only person, only soldier not discharged on arrival in New York. And he turned to me and he said, this is my parents. Turned to his parents, he said, this is Yvonne. Goodbye, I've got to go back to the barracks. He had been declared a security risk. And this had followed him. When he first got to Germany, he was put into a secret unit. And then the report followed. He'd be put back into sentry duty. Then a few months later, he'd be picked up by another unit because of his language. And then a few months later again, he'd be bounced back. And this went on for 2 years. And this went on when we got married. And I had to get a visa to the United States. I was married, we married there. That was no problem. But to get a visa to the United States, I need to be cleared in every country I had worked in. And I had been working in all these different countries. The trouble was that I'd had a secret clearance when I worked for the British, and we had access to all American information. But when I was in the other position, I couldn't get a visa. This went on for months. I didn't know what I was going to be able to do because there was this chance of getting on the troop ship and going to the United States. And my job had ended. The office had closed down. And when I got married, I was about to be sent into China, of all places. I eventually went to the British consul and said, look, I've worked for you all these years. I know I can't get a visa. And within an hour, I had a visa. I mean, it used to make me very angry when it happened the other way around and I was working. So anyway, the story with my husband, since Phil Newman is here, I like to tell this story too. When my husband introduced me to his parents, he said to his father, take her to the Civil Liberties Union in New York tomorrow morning and plead my case. Well, at this time, we didn't even know what the case was. So my first day in the United States was spent at the Civil Liberties Union in New York. I've been a member of the Civil Liberties Union ever since. It was all a big mistake eventually, and this was McCarthy era. The case against my husband was, one, his landlady said he read communist literature. He subscribed to Commonweal, the Catholic magazine. He went by the alias of Fitzgerald. Now, if you say Freccero on the phone, it sounds like Fitzgerald, and if it's not important, you don't correct. Third, he had given $1 to the Owen Lattimore Defense Fund. Owen Lattimore was a hero at Johns Hopkins, and of course he was under suspicion, and so that was counted against him. These were the only things that caused 2 years of turmoil. And 3 weeks after he was discharged, he got a general discharge, not an honourable, not a dishonourable, a general. And 3 weeks later, he got the first letter he'd ever had in print. And it said that his case had been closed with a favourable determination. It never said what the case was. I mean, I found out what it was, but anyway, I'm not going to tell you the full story of my life. Suffice it was, I came to the United States. I was married. I had 4 children. After about 17 years, I got divorced. And in the course of various jobs, I finally answered an ad in the New York Times for registrar of Smith College. I'm the only person I know who got their job through the New York Times. Anyway, I came for an interview, and I'm very grateful to Jill Conway, who chose me. And I came to Northampton and spent very happy years here as registrar at Smith College. And then I went away briefly, took another job the last 8 years until I retired, and returned to Northampton. I couldn't think of a better place to live than Northampton. I had gone down to Princeton, and the contrast was enormous. Northampton's much nicer. And in my first time, and when I was registered at Smith, I was a neighbour of Mary Ford, and my daughter used to babysit for Mary. And so when I returned to Northampton, I asked Mary, what should I do? I'm free, I'm retired. She promptly put me on the housing partnership. I always remember that. And this was at the time, for those of you who were here then, that a homeless man had frozen to death on the railroad tracks down the end of Hawley Street. And Mary, and the ServiceNet Grove Street Inn, the one homeless shelter in town, was full. And so Mary approached all the houses of worship and said, please open your basement and house the homeless during this cold winter. And that started a system whereby 7 churches, every night was a different, and the post was on the pillar downtown that told the homeless people which church to go to that night. And each of the 7 churches had cots in their basement, and a team from that church would bring food to every evening, and someone would volunteer to stay overnight. And ServiceNet provided a staff person. This went on for 2 years first. And then the church said, but we thought this was temporary, just for 1 year. We're not ready to give up our basements for the rest of the time. And so they insisted we should find some place to start a shelter during the winter. And again, since I was retired, as a matter of fact, I bumped into Barry Bouthelette this morning, who had the job first. It was my job to go find a place, an empty place where we could find a shelter. And I spent day in and day out looking in windows, crawling around, trying to find an empty space. And it was really very hard to find. There was nowhere empty. And it was getting close to the winter, and we needed to find a space. The churches wanted their basement. And we did eventually get an offer down on Hawley Street from a building that temporarily was not in use, and the landlord was willing that we should leave it, use it for the winter. And so the town held a meeting for the neighborhood down in Hawley Street. And Peg Keller, who was here this evening, had the job of announcing that we would come down and open the shelter on Hawley Street. And I don't think she was prepared, or I was prepared, or anybody was prepared for the absolutely horrendous meeting that we had. I soon learned the meaning of NIMBY. The neighborhood felt that that they were taken advantage of because there were already a number of houses for various uses down in Hawley Street, and that they had enough and they didn't want, and they felt sure that a homeless shelter, their children would be in danger, their houses would be broken in, there would be drunkenness, there would be litter, and all the rest of it. And everybody was angry, and I felt very badly for the few homeless people who were there at the meeting. I was stunned, and I'm sure Peg, who's here this evening, was also stunned. And we said, all right, we'll go and look again, and we've heard what you say, and we'll see if we can find somewhere. Well, there was only a month or two left, and looked and looked and looked, and there was nowhere. So eventually we decided we'd go ahead, and I wrote a letter to the Daily Hampshire Gazette saying, we did listen to you, we know what you wanted, we heard it, we will do our best, but the choice between somebody else dying on the railroad tracks and opening the shelter at Hawley Street is no choice at all, and we're coming. All the work that went into starting a centre did not come from me. I'm just the lucky one that gets to tell you about it. But it was, first of all the houses of worship jumped in and agreed to serve 1 week every year and take charge of people who come for the shelters, and etc. Provide people to stay overnight. We put out a call for furniture. We got all the cots from the Red Cross. There's one lovely story attached to it. Carl, who had been homeless in the shelter, in the churches when we were there, this homeless man volunteered to paint the new building from top to bottom. And he came in the weeks that we were waiting to open, and he painted every inch of it. We scarcely spoke. I was there every day with him, and I still know Carl. We all know Carl who knows it. He's a great friend of the shelter. But he, at that time, was very silent and very quiet and kind of ashamed, as we found a lot of homeless people feel ashamed about being there. It's often through no fault of their own, but there is shame attached to it, as we learned at the meeting we heard. So anyway, November 1st came, and we were ready to open. Volunteers were there. We opened the doors, and we were picketed. The neighborhood came out, they handed out leaflets and saying, you know, you shouldn't be here and all the rest of it. But that was the end of it. We went ahead. Everything was fine. We had promised to make sure that everybody would leave the neighborhood at 7 o'clock in the morning, so we made sure that the homeless were escorted out of the area. And this is where we continued for the rest of that winter. We stayed there really with no trouble. It was wonderful, all the volunteers, and believe me, I'm only the spokesperson, but the people who did the work were all the people of Northampton who really knuckled under. We needed money, we raised money, we brought teams, volunteered to bring 3-course meals in every evening. Somebody else would volunteer to spend the night. And the reception was really wonderful. So another year came around, and we still hadn't found any wells. So Mary and I went around door to door down Howley Street. I'm so glad you're here this evening. And we knocked on the door and said, tell us what happened last year, how do you feel about it, etc. And everybody was fine. Nobody had any objection. Everything was fine. It was cool. You'd never know there'd been so much opposition. So we stayed another year in the shelter. But then, I think it was only 2 years in the shelter, then the landlord needed the building, and we would have to find another place. So the hunt started again. It was just as difficult as before. Nobody wanted a shelter. There was nowhere to go, nothing we're doing. And we had another horrendous meeting. On this occasion, a different crowd of people, but people stood up and said the most awful things about homeless people, and I was still shocked, and everybody else. And the thing I remember most about this meeting was the head of police, the chief of police, Sinkovich, got up on the platform and told the crowd, behave, you've got to be civil, which was amazing to me. And anyway, another meeting. At this point, we had another savior. It was the year that the new fire station had opened on King Street. And Sut Jali, the head of the Media Foundation, had bought the old firehouse building on Masonic Street. and said that we would be welcome to use the second floor of the fire station. So we set to work again. There was a lot of work. It was very, very dirty. And the unique thing about the fire station was, of course, if we had a shelter, we'd need a second exit. And the second exit for firemen is the firemen. This did not pass muster. So we had to build a second exit to the fire station from the second floor before we could occupy it. But there was one thing that was very nice about we stayed in the fire station 3 years. Interesting, I learned years and years ago, when there were homeless people in Northampton, they used to take shelter at the fire station in those days, so it was interesting. But one thing that was nice about the fire station was the huge building, and you didn't feel so claustrophobic as you can. So many people crowded together. It was dirty, it was not very pleasant, but it was big and airy, and you didn't feel claustrophobic there. So we spent 3 years there, and the organization grew. It was really amazing. By this time, we had reached out to the houses of worship in all the towns around. So we had helpers. Teams came in from Southampton, East Hampton, West Hampton, Wilmsburg. We had 2 teams from Amherst, because there wasn't a shelter in Amherst in those days. And these teams would come in, and there was a team there every single evening bringing a hot meal, and somebody else would stay overnight. So we spent 3 years, and we were growing by this time, a lot more volunteers, and we had learned how to fundraise, something that none of us were experienced at, but it's amazing. Somebody once said, you just ask. And in a way, that's true. We just asked, and the money came in, again, mainly in the beginning through the houses of worship. But gradually, by now, we were becoming to know. And I have to say, I think the presence of the shelter changed the climate in this town towards homeless people. Homeless were no longer thought of as being thieves, difficult people causing trouble, whatever. It began to understand that, and we all who spent time in the shelter really began to understand that, but for the grace of God, any of us could be homeless. It takes one loss of job, or being turned out from one apartment, or a breakup in a family, or an illness, and you can be homeless without ever expecting it. And it's a very sad time. The other thing we notice is that often when people come to the shelter for the first time, they're very quiet, very shy, very depressed. And the fact that there's a group of people from the town they live in who are there to help them, to feed them, to be friends, means a huge amount. And it really, I think, apart from the physical benefits of having the shelter, what people brought to the homeless was even more important. They made them feel welcome. They didn't have to feel ashamed that they were homeless. And the rules that started in the early days in the shelter more or less have carried ever since. I might tell you, Richard Hart, Rick, is here this evening, who succeeded me as head of the homeless, and I hope we'll speak to you later. The rules that the organization of the shelter has not changed much. ServiceNet, we're still very grateful to ServiceNet, who provides a staff person during the hours that is open and every night. One of them is here this evening. I'm happy to see 2 of you.
4.
And 2, yes. And,
4.
That's right. 4. Oh, I'm sorry. And wonderful people to work with. The pattern is that people lined up about, starting around about 5:30 in the evening. The doors open at 6. Homeless come in, register. We don't ask for any police control whatsoever, but we do ask if they have any weapons, would they hand them in, or any knives, etc. And then they're allotted a bed, a bunk. I should bring us at this point what happened to us after the fire station, because where the shelter is now was the one following the 3 years in the fire station. By this time, we realized that homelessness, unfortunately, was here to stay, and we really needed to plan for something on a permanent scale. And so, with the help of the city, we were allowed to use the CDBG funds, and were able to buy the place where we now hold the shelter in Centre Street. First of all, it was the Masonic Lodge, and when the Masonic Lodge went on the market, first of all, the person who owns the Artists Guild, what's his name? Thank you. And he offered to buy it and let us use the ground floor for the shelter. And this was a wonderful offer. Unfortunately, he himself went bankrupt in the course of it. And again, another savior, Claire Bateman, came to the front, purchased the building, and agreed to sell us the ground floor with a CDBG fund from the city to use as the homeless shelter. So finally, we had a permanent home, and we had raised money, so we were able to buy equipment for the kitchen. We had 3 wonderful showers where people could take showers. We even had a washing machine and dryer, so when the homeless come in at night, they can sign up and wash their clothes and dry them, so that next day, if they're going for a job interview or looking for a house, they can both have a shower and clean clothes. When they arrive at the shelter and they're given a bed, there are also 2 lists to sign up, one to do chores during the evening and one to take showers. And the same pattern, as far as I know, continues ever since, right? Teams still from all around still come and bring a 3-course meal, serve them, and originally, one person of the team would stay until 9 o'clock when the volunteer for overnight arrives. And then about 10 years ago, correct me if I'm 10 roughly, we had the marvelous chance of having students from Smith College who would take it in turns to team up and come down at 7:30 every evening and stay till 9 o'clock. So whoever had been there with the team were able to go home. And usually after a working day, they were very glad to be able to leave. And the students took turns, and well, I'll leave you to tell about how we've got the team. Teams of the students came down every evening and cleaned up the kitchen, and with any time left over, would sit down and chat with the homeless. And I have to say, this too has been a wonderful addition. The students comment on their stay in the shelter that for some of them, it's almost the most important thing that happens to them when they come to Smith. They feel as if they're part of the city, but also they learn about the homeless, and the writings that some of them have written about their experience is just amazing. One young woman came during her freshman year. She was of Iranian origin, and she spent all 4 years volunteering at the shelter that she was at Smith, and wrote beautifully about it afterwards. So I should wind up at this point. You had mentioned the lines from somebody who lived in Yvonne's house, and I'm going to leave to Rick after this to tell you about our other houses that the houses started. But Yvonne's house was the first house that the Friends of the Homeless purchased and made available to 6 chronically homeless people who'd spent their life in shelters. And one of them was the person who wrote the letter that was quoted today. I think I've talked enough, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. I should mention that I'm very deaf, so if I can't hear you, I'll ask somebody to repeat the question to me. anybody have any questions that they want to ask? Yes.
What year was the Holly Street shelter
It was
open?
in 90, oh, help me someone. Which year was it that the...
I'm in the 90s.
91, 92, I think.
95, 96.
Do I hear?
95, 96.
Because when we came here,
I came in 94.
That's right, so I came in 95. And we were in these churches, 95.
Yes,
Yeah.
95,
Yeah.
96.
Okay, churches 95, Holly 96.
And 96.
And the firehouse?
The firehouse was after Holy. Yeah.
But, so it was in the
Yeah.
2000s.
We actually had fun. I hate to have mentioned about Holy Street in a terrible meeting, because we actually had a very happy stay after that in Holy Street, and we were forgiven. Now, then I'm going to ask Rick to take on from here and to tell you about the activities of the shelter and the housing first part of all what we did, right?
I didn't prepare a lot to say because I thought this was going to be Yvonne. So, I had a question for you I didn't ask. Did you ever slide down the pole in the
Never did.
No? Yeah. Eh? Yeah.
I asked, did you?
Well, I don't go that far back, actually. That's why I didn't expect to be speaking. I'm not historic. I moved here. I moved here about 11 years ago, and originally was working at Forbes Library. I'm a librarian. Was a librarian. I guess you're always a librarian, but I'm retired now. And also got involved with the Friends almost right away. And partly because libraries get a lot of homeless people in them. And so the Friends asked if someone from the library would come and be a representative on the board, and I volunteered. And they haven't let go of me yet. So.
Volunteering.
Yes, well, it's what comes of volunteering to Yvonne. You're stuck once she's gotten you. Many people here know that. So I also have, for different reasons, have always been concerned with marginal and outside and people that are struggling kind of people for various reasons. So this was a natural thing for me, and I like helping people. So yeah, Yvonne has said everything really about the stuff we do in terms of the shelter. She didn't mention associated things we do that have developed over the years. We buy winter footwear for people if they need it. We help people with move-in money when people get enough of an income that they can afford to live somewhere, but they can't. There's this huge obstacle of all those security deposits and first and last month. And you know, I will say, so many people here know about the shelter and a lot about homeless people, but one thing that was a real education to me when I started volunteering there was I would come in with a meal team usually, and they would be saying, hold a couple of meals because so-and-so isn't back from work yet. And I thought, they're working, but they're in the homeless shelter. I mean, this was like, it was just, and of course it speaks to the whole issue that Yvonne mentioned, that, you know, we're not talking people that are homeless because there's, you know, they're lazy or because there's something they've done that was their fault. It just happens to people. And so anyway, we have a lot of associated things like that now. We help people with prescriptions, while the service net people who I'm looking at now are trying to get them signed up with Mass Health. But we did, just around the time I joined the board, Yvonne and Peg and other people in the Friends had gotten interested in the housing first idea of basically the best way to stop someone from being homeless is give them a home, or provide a home. So the Friends, at the time I was first involved, were starting to raise money for a house that could be used to take some people out of homelessness. And the way they developed this, which is very ingenious, we're all volunteers, so we can't we can't manage a property. There's no one to do it. So what they came up with, I say they because this was before me, was the idea of raising the money for a house, buying a house, fixing it up, and then turning it over to an agency that can run it with an agreement, that it's all sort of tied in so that it can't be distracted from it, diverted. And ServiceNet was the first partner for Yvonne's house. Since then, we did another house, which is partnered with Gandara Centers, which also runs Hairston House in town, which is a house for people that have been homeless who are also in recovery from substance abuse, which can be is a very frequent problem. And sometimes people maybe are homeless partly because they have a substance abuse problem. Sometimes they have a substance abuse problem partly because they're homeless. And it's like a cycle. And we are currently in the process of doing a third house, which is going to be for young people aged 18 to 24, because each time we've tried to identify a population that needed a little extra help. And there are plenty more special populations that we could be helping in the future. So we went through a process this time, for instance, which I was involved with, of deciding what to target this time, and we ended up with young people. We looked at other things. We looked at the issue of people coming out of the jail, which is a terrible cycle of jail and homelessness and jail and homelessness, which is almost impossible to escape from on your own because you can't get jobs, you can't get a place to live, you're barred from many places. We looked at women on their own, or women maybe partnering with one of the agencies that helps women fleeing domestic abuse. We looked at all these things, but we came up with young people, because in one sense, we were seeing people at the shelter who are young, and if something doesn't happen, they often just cycle on into chronic homelessness as time goes on. And we thought if we can just cut off that pipeline, we'll be avoiding. I like to say sometimes we're the only business that wants to get rid of all our customers. Hopefully this will help cut off some of that pipeline. So we have a property, and we've done a ton of fundraising in the last 2 or 3 years, to actually longer, because we usually get seed money first. And it's a two-piece project it turned out to be, because our target was 8 to 10 young people at a time, and we couldn't afford a house that was that many units. They become rental property, they become investment properties, so the price goes way, way up. What we ended up doing was buying a house that had enough space for 4 young people, and it also had a second lot attached to it. And our plan, the current house is really ready now, so hopefully young people will be moving in very quickly now. Our partner for this one is Dial Self, which is an agency that's been mostly active in Franklin County. They started in, but they've already been doing some stuff in a couple of other counties. When I mentioned to Peg first that we were thinking of partnering with them, she said, yes, I've wanted them here for years. And so they hopefully will be getting people in there very quickly. I think they're interviewing already. But we still have to do the second building, which turned out to be, as new buildings often do, a little more complicated and a little more expensive than we realized. So we're still raising funds for that, although we're most of the way there. So I would just put in a pitch for, if anyone's interested in that, I can tell them more about it. There are donation envelopes and brochures out by the door, and some of our newsletters from the last couple of years. Either Yvonne or I or some other people here, Barbara, could answer questions about what we do. We also always need volunteers, not just to do the meals and the overnight shifts and helping clean the shelter and all those things. We need volunteers to help do the background work, the events, the fundraising. We have that thing every holiday season of singers downtown, and we have a concert in the middle of winter, and we have Shelter Sunday. We need help with all those things, because without the funds, it doesn't happen. So that would be very welcome as well. I would say a couple of things just at the end. It's so appropriate this is being done with this exhibit up, for one thing. So I've been appreciating that. And I also really appreciate the fact that Historic Northampton is doing, I guess, what you would call current history. I actually was a local history librarian for years, so I love local history. And I was talking about oral history before, and I was involved with an oral history project for many years. And the Historical Society in the town my library was in, when I first was working there, was not interested in anything after the Civil War at the latest. They really, they were very, very DAR oriented. The DAR is wonderful. They do a lot of good historical stuff, but I was this local history librarian, and I thought we should be doing 20th century history, which is what it was then. Of course, we're in another century now. And finally, during the time I was there, they started doing some more recent history, which is important to do when it's happening or when it's recent, because it's gone after a while. If you're researching something 200 years ago, it can be done, but a lot of the material is gone. So it's really important to collect this stuff now while the people are still around to be photographed or to be interviewed or whatever. So I really applaud the Historical Society for doing that. And we still have time. I see Peter has his hand up. Yes.
First of all, thank you very much for your involvement. We appreciate it.
He's another charter member of the Friends of the Homeless. Oh, yes.
Yes, and another standing member of Living History, thankfully. But my question is, under the current administration's intentional slashing of social services of course, we need $1 trillion for nuclear bombs. Are our shelters and the other shelters in our region in jeopardy?
Well, I mean, the short answer is yes, of course. Everything is in jeopardy at this point, sadly, because, well, I shouldn't get political. I personally think we have a bunch of maniacs in Washington at this point. But I realize not everyone feels that way, but I have to be so careful when I'm speaking as the Friends of the Homeless person, because we have some really great supporters who don't agree with me politically, and so that's not our stance. But yes, I think they are at risk, and I think also homelessness is going to be more of a problem because the safety net is being shredded, and so I was saying before that we started to someone. Occasionally, people ask something along the lines of, if you're providing all this new housing for people and you have the shelters, why do you need more stuff? And I said, well, the truth is, as fast as we move them into housing, more people are becoming homeless at the other end. We have actually, in the last few years, we've had fewer, chronic homeless isn't the right term. What's the phrase I want for people that are no. Maybe is chronic what I want? People. No. Okay. Well, anyway, I'll say chronic. We have fewer people that are really long-term. We see them constantly, year after year after year after year after year, because some of them are living in Yvonne's house now and the other place. So, but we're seeing a lot of new people, a lot of new faces, which is very discouraging. But what can you do? You just keep fighting and working to improve the situation as much as you can. And I have to give a real shout out to the people that are working on the front lines. I'm sort of a backline person in many ways, but the caseworkers who are working with people, how they don't totally burn out, I don't understand, because it's incredibly challenging. And I'm facing 4 of them right here who work at the. Oh yes, absolutely. So it's just wonderful, and so we will cope somehow, I think.
How many people do you serve that are from other communities? Yvonne mentioned that there were no homeless shelters in Amherst. There are in Amherst. Okay.
Yeah, we have. Excuse me.
Something I forgot that you should tell them. The Happy Frog. The Happy Frog.
Oh, Happy Frog, yes, I will do that. Remind me, Happy Frog. She should be up here. Yes, one of the stereotypes about homelessness that people have sometimes is that, am I getting in there? Now I am. Is that people are coming in on the railroad. So this goes back to the 30s, this stereotype. And they're all from somewhere else. I mean, the majority of our people are from the valley. For a long time, and I think this is changing slightly, but we tended to have about a third of the people were from Northampton and the surrounding towns. And another, more than a third, was from the rest of the valley. You know, a lot of people from Hamden County come up here. And some from Franklin. And then we had a few that were from out of the area. Often those people were here because they had a connection here of some kind. They didn't just hear about Northampton in California or something. I mean, we do have a reputation, but I don't think it's quite that. I think the Hamden percentage has gone up a little in the last year or two, yeah, because they're really being overwhelmed. So. Yes, Yvonne reminded me, Happy Frog. We have a wonderful project that was promoted by one of our board members, and Yvonne and she worked on it together. To people, many people here probably know Happy Frog. He lives on downtown Northampton on Main Street. And he's actually a piggy bank that collects money for community lunches, and it goes to some of those soup kitchen lunches and pays for thousands of those every year. It's really wonderful. And two things about Happy Frog, one of which may be new to a lot of people, because you would know because you talked to Karen. One is that Peg, who is the person who goes and says hi to Happy Frog and collects the money, every once in a while she goes and she finds $500 or $600 in it, all together in large bills. So obviously there's some, she calls this person the Frog Fairy, and so, which is just neat. And I wish we knew who it was so I could thank them, even if they wanted to be anonymous. So if one of you is the Frog Fairy, let me know. I won't tell anyone else, but at least I can thank you. It's so frustrating not to be able to thank someone. The other thing is that recently I found out, I got a call and someone said, this is a strange call, but are you the group that has the Happy Frog sculpture? And I said, yes. And she said, well, my family had gotten the original Happy Frog design in memory of our son and gave it to a hospital. I forget the hospital, somewhere out in eastern Mass. And the hospital was moving it outside for the first time after all these years. Their one is much older than ours. And we're worried about the condition. Will it get verdigris or will it deteriorate in the open weather? What do you do to protect it? And I had to say, I know we don't do anything now. We haven't done anything since I've been president. And Karen and I guess Yvonne thought that maybe it had been treated in the beginning once with some kind of coating. So I don't know what will happen with their frog. I hope they'll talk to an art conservation person. That's what they should do. But it was sort of neat to me to realize that Happy Frog has a twin or a brother somewhere else, So, yeah.
You should know that the Happy Frog was a sculptor, was Sue Stubbs' mother. And when she heard we were looking for a statue, she took Karen and me to her studio, and she said, and we commented on this beautiful little frog with his cap and his shoes, and she said, you can have him if you want to bronze him. So she gave us the Happy Frog. So he's really a Northamptonite.
Another well-known Northampton resident. So that's all I have, but I think it's great this is happening. I can't, what can I do with following Yvonne? I mean,